Hey everyone, so this is a short video on figurative language in literature. We're going to go over the most common types of figurative language you would run into in an English class, either high school or college, and we're going to look at some examples of each. Here's all the ones we're going to go over. We're going to start with imagery and work our way down. If there's one that you need to skip ahead to because you're looking for a particular one, you can just skip ahead in the video, but I recommend that you watch the entire thing because it never hurts to get a review on some of these because there's quite a few and they're difficult to remember. So firstly, what is figurative language? It's when you describe something by comparing it with something else, you're probably using some type of figurative language. This is the language of poetry. Poetry is built on figurative language, and when you understand more about figurative language, then you start to really appreciate the genius of poetry and how difficult it is for writers to employ figurative language. And this is in contrast with literal language, which is what we use in everyday speak. But anytime someone compares something, they're probably using some type of figurative language. So it's hard to get through your day without using figurative language. One of them is imagery. It's a descriptive language that appeals to the senses and helps paint pictures in one's mind. So it uses the five senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, taste. You can either do it when you're speaking to someone or when you're writing, and the idea is to try and build up or paint a picture in the mind of the listener or the reader. And that's known as imagery because you're literally creating an image in their mind, or you're trying to anyway. Simile. This is often confused with metaphor, so hopefully we can straighten it out. There's basically some key words that if you look for those, you can't go wrong. So a simile is an explicit and direct comparison between two things that are similar in some way, and usually the way in which they're similar is not obvious, hence the need for the simile. And it uses the words like or as in an attempt to compare. So that's the key part there. If you see the words like or as, it's a simile. If it uses the to be verb, it's a metaphor, and we'll get to that in a second. Here's an example of a simile: brave as a lion. You see the word as, it's comparing someone who is brave as a lion, or brave in the way that a lion is brave. So it's comparing lions and brave people, and they're saying they're similar to each other in some way. Another example: life is like an onion. You peel it off one layer at a time, and sometimes you cry. So life is not an onion, but it's like an onion, and the explanation gives the relationship there. But the point here is that you see like or as in comparison, and that's what makes it a simile. With a metaphor, it's the same thing, except it doesn't use like or as. It uses some form of the verb to be. So the road was a ribbon wrapped through the desert. The road obviously is not actually a ribbon, but the road meanders in a way that's similar to how a ribbon meanders. So it's a comparison between the two things, but it doesn't use the words like or as. It uses to be, a verb, in this case was. Another example: my heart is a lonely hunter that hunts on a lonely hill. Comparing the heart to a hunter, they have the same motivations in some ways, so that's the connection. But it uses the to be verb is. And I keep going back and forth between metaphor and simile because this is usually what people get confused on. I even get confused on it sometimes. So really just remember like or as is a simile, and some form of the to be verb is a metaphor. Okay, alliteration. This is a fun one. It's the repetition of a consonant or a vowel sound, and it occurs at the beginning of words or within words. So when you have a sentence and you have the same sound happening, whether it's at the beginning of the word or somewhere in the middle, that's alliteration. So here's an example: she was wide-eyed and wondering while she waited for Walter to waken. That w sound is creating the alliteration. Another example would be: who washed Washington's white woolen underwear when Washington's washerwoman went west, which is way over the top. But you get the idea, that w sound being repeated, whether it's at the beginning of a word or somewhere in the middle, as it's repeated over and over and over in a sentence, that is what alliteration is. Okay, personification. It's a figure of speech which gives the qualities of a person to an animal, an object, or an idea. So for example, the stars danced playfully in the moonlit sky. Stars aren't actually dancing, but that gives them a human-like quality because humans dance, and stars in this case move in a way that seems similar to a human. So hence the stars danced playfully in the moonlit sky. Another example: the rundown house appeared depressed. Houses can't be depressed, but depression is a human quality. So when we give an object a human quality, we're using personification. Symbolism. It's a place, object, or being that represents or stands for an abstract or universal idea. This one's pretty straightforward, but symbols are important because they save space. You can use an object or a thing to represent an idea, and that idea to explain would have taken a lot of words. So with a symbol, you can get a big explanation packed into a small, either a single word or, in the case of art, a picture. So for example, the four-leaf clover is a symbol that represents luck, as well as the Irish. So when you see a four-leaf clover, no one needs to explain to you the concept of luck or the concept of the Irish. That idea springs into your head when you see that picture. So that's an effective symbol. Another would be a dove representing peace. Okay, hyperbole, not to be confused with hyperbole. The correct pronunciation is hyperbole. It's basically exaggeration. It's an exaggerated statement used to emphasize a point or evoke strong feelings. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's an over-the-top exaggeration to drive home your point. So for example, I laughed my head off when he said the joke. My head obviously didn't come off when I laughed, but it's a way of expressing an unlikely thing using exaggeration. I mean, really the simplest way to think of hyperbole is it's just exaggeration. Another example, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Well, you probably can't really be that hungry because a horse is so much bigger than you, but you're trying to express or give some kind of emphasis through exaggeration. So hyperbole equals exaggeration. Onomatopoeia, it's a fun one to say. It's the use of words that imitate or suggest the sound that it describes. So the firecracker made a loud kaboom. When you say the word kaboom, it's almost similar to the sound a firecracker makes. Buzz, fizz, swoosh, sizzle, zoom, thump. Other examples would be snap, crackle, pop. The word snap, when you say it, makes a snapping sound. So onomatopoeia is a word in which the sound describes the thing that the word represents. Allusion, it's a brief reference, whether it's explicit or indirect, to a person, a place, or event in another literary work. So for example, Animal Farm is an allusion to the Russian Revolution. So that one doesn't pop up too much, but it's basically just some type of reference. Oxymoron, most people probably know this one. It's the placing of two contradictory words together to create an effect. There's a ton of examples. Just one quick one, jumbo shrimp. Jumbo by definition is big, shrimp by definition is small. But when you put them together, you get a contradiction in terms. It's an oxymoron. It's two words that contradict each other smashed together. Anaphora. It's the repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of a clause or a phrase to build emphasis. And this will make sense when we see the examples. Strike as I struck the foe, strike as I would have struck those tyrants, strike deep as my curse, strike and but once. So in this case, Byron uses the word strike over and over again to build up some kind of tension. Lincoln's inaugural address, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right. That repetition of with creates a certain cadence to the sentence, so it's very poetic in a way, and it emphasizes something. So it's designed to build up some kind of emphasis. Mad World, Mad Kings, Mad Composition, another example from Shakespeare. And let's look at one example just in a paragraph so you can see that it's not always single sentences. But in this case, Churchill uses the phrase, we shall fight, over and over and over to build up a sense of his urgency, a sense of his resolve. So repetition to build some kind of tension is anaphora. Motif. It's a recurring detail, and that detail can be almost anything. A structure, a contrast, some sort of literary device, an object, a color, an idea, and it repeats itself throughout a text, and it usually has to do with the major themes of the text. So in The House on Mango Street by Cisneros, women are always sitting by windows. So in this case, women by windows is a motif to show how women are trapped by their husbands, fathers, children, or their own feelings of inadequacy. So throughout the book, women are always sitting at a window looking out, and that's meant to represent the plight of those women. And because it happens over and over, it's a motif. Another example would be the color yellow in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. How you want to interpret that is completely beside the point, but the repetition of that object or idea or color is a motif. Apostrophe, not to be confused with the punctuation. It's different. So it's some absent, non-human, non-existent person or thing that is addressed as if it were alive and capable of understanding. Again, the examples should help. So blue moon, you saw me standing alone without a dream in my heart. Blue moon is a thing, but it can't really see someone standing with a dream in their heart, but they're speaking to the moon as though it could. So that's apostrophe. Another example, bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. Keats is addressing the star as though it can hear him. Or in this case, hello darkness, my old friend, I've come to talk with you again. Paul Simon from Simon and Garfunkel. Darkness is not Simon's friend. It's not aware of him. Darkness is just a state of, it's the absence of light. That's all it is. But in this case, Paul Simon is speaking to it as though it could understand him. So that's apostrophe. Synecdoche, not synecdoche, or however, I've heard this pronounced a lot of different ways, but synecdoche is the correct pronunciation. It's a little tough, so let's see if we can figure it out. It's when a part is used to refer to the whole, or the whole to the part, or for a part. So for example, hired hands refers to men paid to work for someone. If you say, I've hired 10 hands to work for me this summer, you're not talking about hiring 10 pairs of hands. In this case, hands, the word hands represents the entire body of the person who's working for you. Or the fleet was 5 sail. Sail refers to the entire ship. So it's not that there was 5 sails. I mean, a ship has multiple sails. But the word sail is used to represent the entire ship. So I know that's a little confusing, but synecdoche is when a part is used to refer to the whole, or the reverse of that. Juxtaposition. This is the act or instance of placing two things close together or side by side in order to create some kind of effect or reaction. Usually it's used to compare and contrast, which means to show the similarities or show the differences between two things. So in film, they'll use shots, and the juxtaposition of those shots creates meaning in the audience's mind. So looking at a picture of a broken mirror and then looking at a picture of one of the main characters, it's creating some kind of similarity or meaning between those two things by putting them next to each other. And in literature, it's basically the same thing with images. So it's some attempt to draw the attention of the reader and make some kind of point by that. So for example, he was slouched alertly. The juxtaposition of slouched and alert, if one is alert, one generally does not slouch. If one is slouching, one is not alert. When you put those two things together, it catches the eye of the reader, and that's really the point of it, is to try and get you to notice something, whatever that something is. So here's an example. Let's look at the picture on the right. The photographer has taken the picture of what looks like some kind of old building with some very modern building, and they're right next to each other. They are juxtaposed, and that can mean something, whatever it means to you or whatever your interpretation of that is. By taking two things and putting them together, you're showing some type of relationship, and the idea is that you're supposed to develop an idea about what that relationship is. Irony. It's when the opposite of what you expect or what you could reasonably expect to happen happens. So verbal irony is when a character states one thing and means another. Dramatic irony is when the reader knows more about a situation or a character than the characters in the story do. And situational irony is a contrast between what the reader expects to happen and what actually happens, which is generally what happens in life too. So there's lots of different types of irony, but it's basically just the opposite of what you could reasonably expect. So when something happens, if the natural, or how should I put it? If you could reasonably expect something to happen based on the conditions of the environment, and then the exact opposite happens, that's usually ironic. Enjambment. We're not going to spend too much time on this. It's kind of a tough one, and it really only applies to poetry, but it's the continuation of a sentence or clause over a line break. Let me show you what that looks like. So you've got the beginning of the sentence, which should be, I call that piece a wonder. That the beginning of the sentence is jammed up onto the top line. So that's how I remember it. I remember a piece of this sentence has been jammed somewhere it doesn't belong. This is also used to develop cadence and rhythm in poetry, which we won't talk about, but when you see a piece of a sentence spliced off and stuck on a different line, that's enjambment. Paradox. It's a seemingly true statement or a group of statements that leads to a contradiction or a situation which seems to defy logic or intuition. So for example, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. Okay, so it's a paradox because if you learned from history that you don't learn from history, then you couldn't have learned from history. So how is it that you learned from history? That was probably really confusing, but that's the point. A paradox is basically taking two things that can't really happen. And, or for example, in seeking happiness, one does not find happiness. So it's kind of a catch-22, I suppose. So if you know what a catch-22 is, a catch-22 is usually a paradox. So a great place to meet people is at a concert, but maybe you hate music, and so the type of people that you would meet at a concert are not the type of people you would want to meet. That's a catch-22. It's also a paradox. Anadiplosis. It's kind of a hard one to say. It's from the Greek doubling or folding up. It's the repetition of the last word of a preceding clause, and the word is used at the end of a sentence and then used again at the beginning of the next sentence. That'll make sense in a second. So here we have famous: fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. The final word of the sentence is used to begin the next sentence. So you've got anger ending the first sentence and beginning the next one, hate ending the second sentence and beginning the third. Another example from the movie Gladiator: they call for you, the general who became a slave, the slave who became a gladiator, the gladiator who defied an emperor. So notice the repetition of slave. It ends a sentence, begins the next one. Gladiator ends the sentence and begins the next one. Famous one: I am Sam, Sam I am. So that's the most common types of figurative language you're going to run into, and I'll leave you with a little quiz. So I hope that presentation was good, but maybe it was clear as mud. So see if you can figure out what types of figurative language clear as mud could be. Two come to mind right away. Maybe you can think of more. I hope that was helpful. When in doubt, Google it, because there's a lot of examples out there, and examples are usually the best way to figure these things out. So I hope that was helpful. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thanks.